Maybe we could start now.
Yeah. Ok, attends, il y a encore des gens. Ouais. Sorry, because there are some people. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we can start, and if people join, they join. Yeah. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We are so grateful to have you here at our very first event for McGill for Nurses for Planetary Health. Still people coming in. Sorry, it's a lot of gestion. Maybe we can wait a little bit more, finalement.
Is Alex able to let people in?
I don't. Maybe our bouncer can.
You can start, Rosemary. I'll let people in
Okay.
au fur et à mesure que le monde rentre.
Thank you. You're so nice. Okay. So again, welcome everyone. So it's our first event for McGill Nurses for Planetary Health.
So before we introduce our incredible speakers, I'll start with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that McGill is situated on unceded Ganyangahaga land. Indigenous land defenders are in an ongoing struggle for protection of their rights under law, for protection of the earth, and for self-determination. Their fight is ongoing thanks to settler colonial governments and the capitalist institutions they protect and finance. Educational systems like McGill have established themselves as agents of colonialism with their heavy investment in big oil, among other things. Its curriculum also plays a large role in maintaining inequalities in prestige, income, and in structures of our society. We acknowledge that in this space, it is everyone's responsibility and in everyone's best interest to ally ourselves with land back activists and fight back against the colonialism still present in our institutions. Here we linked a site that tells you what land you stand on, the nativeland.ca, and 3 of many ongoing land back actions going on in Canada. We encourage you to find out how to support the actions near you.
So yeah, so to start, just a little presentation of our new group. So we are McGill Nurses for Planetary Health. So my name is Rosemary. I'm a second year in BSCN, and I'm with my colleague.
I'm Naomi. I'm in my first year.
And our mandate is to advocate for planetary health in the ASEAN and its community. So just for a little background for the name, but it will be much explained later. So planetary health is the health of human civilization and the state of the natural structural system on which it depends. So it's really just a concept to understand more that the health of of a person is really in strong relationship with the quality of its environment and the social condition it lives in.
So just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your mic off when others are speaking, and at the end there'll be a question period, so save those for the end. And you can use the chat function at the bottom to ask those questions, or you can raise your hand and one of us will give you your word. And we're hoping to end the event at 8:30. Great, so without further ado, it is our pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Fiona Hanley, who is an advocate for nursing leadership in environmental and climate health. She is course lecturer at McGill and a nursing faculty member at Dawson College. She is the Quebec representative for the Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment and is a member of the OIQ Climate Committee and co-authored the 2019 position paper, Les impacts des changements climatiques sur la santé des populations et la pratique infirmière. And she is part of the expert committee for the position paper, Infirmières et infirmiers à l'avant-garde d'une planète en santé. So I pass it to you, Fiona.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. And hope that you can, can you see my screen okay?
Perfect.
Okay, good. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this great launch of the McGill Nurses for Planetary Health. So I'm going to try to respond, at least in part, to those two questions that you had posed at the beginning. I have to say I have so much admiration for you students driving this initiative, and that I think that you really understand that the hope comes from action, the rolling up of the sleeves that drives us forward and upstream, often against the current. But that the current is changing as finally people are realizing the extent of the harm we have done to our planet that has taken so many hits, to the point it is now in a state of multi-system failure, as Dr. Teddy Potter, nurse academic, so aptly puts it, and that it therefore needs a multi-system collaborative approach to tackle the issues. Nurses are key players in this approach at the front lines of healthcare, with a long history of addressing inequalities and inequities and advocating for the need to move towards a paradigm of ecocentric thinking, where environment is considered as a living whole, interconnected to us as humans at a deep level, but also of nursing's fundamental responsibilities in promoting health and well-being, preventing disease, and alleviating suffering as the expression of social justice work and caring for humanity and environment. In the short amount of time I have with you this evening, I would really like just to talk about planetary health. You might be familiar with this term, which, as Naomi says, refers to an emerging field of research and practice that offers a multifaceted response to the global ecological crisis we are facing. As it's now come to be known in the mainstream of science and medicine, planetary health, I'm just going to adjust my computer a bit here, has deep roots both in Indigenous knowledge, and here I would like to recognize Ellen, Gabriel, and Richard Budgell, who will be speaking shortly. But the origins of planetary health also lie in multiple streams of environmental and holistic health movements, informed, for example, in the work of medical groups against nuclear war, in the writings of Rachel Carson, the American biologist who first made us aware of the devastating effects of pesticides on wildlife with her book Silent Spring, and who sadly died of breast cancer in 1964 while still fighting to ban these chemicals. It has also grown out of the expanded thinking through the years about the intersection of health and the environment in themes of eco-health, environmental health, one health, and also from the work of nurse scholars and activists who have long called for the transformation of nursing's environmental consciousness and political engagement at local, national, and international levels. All of these ideas have contributed to the deepening recognition and increasing sense of urgency amongst health professionals and healthcare organizations of the interdependence of humans and ecosystems, and the fragility of life that is threatened by accelerating changes, but also of our dependence upon green and blue spaces for restoration, for happiness and well-being. 2021 is a year that offers us many challenges and opportunities, and we're still in the midst of a global pandemic that continues to strain our health systems and health workers to the limits, but has also shown us the power of global cooperation. We've just seen a major political change south of our border with the election of Joe Biden that has global implications for the health and well-being of all on this planet, brought about by people collaborating together and exercising their right to vote in record numbers, some of them for the first time, but exercising it in a way to bring about change for the better. This kind of ambitious engagement is what is needed to resolve and to work towards the ecological emergency we are facing. So just a bit more about planetary health. This is a new discipline, but also a very old concept that has been reworked and reborn, and recently has become a thriving global movement, I could say, following publication in the Lancet journal in 2015. This long established medical journal began to see the limits of their what could be seen as a rather narrow academic vision of health and medicine, focused on random controlled trials of new medications and so forth. But they saw that given the challenges arising from ecological disruption, it was time to put themselves front and center and bring attention to the health implications of climate change initially as the greatest health challenge, but also the greatest public health opportunity of the 21st century with their publications of 2009 and 2015 on climate and health. And also a 2014 manifesto, which called for a transformation of public health in the light of overconsumption and unsustainable development, and urging the creation of a movement for planetary health with the vision of a planet that nourishes and sustains the diversity of life with which we coexist and on which we depend. And so in 2015, they launched what became the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health. So as I said, it's a transdisciplinary field cutting across traditional divisions between fields of research and practice, and that bridges the divides between what were previously siloed disciplines and fields of endeavor such as medical science, food science, engineering, veterinary science, urban planning, climate research, political science, ecology, the arts, social sciences, and many more. So bringing people really from multiple countries around the world, multiple communities within those countries, working on different solutions by combining their own knowledge. Humans have known since ancient times that our environments influence our health and well-being. And as Ellen Gabriel and Richard Budgell know well, through the ages, Indigenous peoples have felt a profound spiritual connection to the earth and nature, and the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit, developing wisdom and knowledge and resilience over thousands of years. At the beginning of Western medicine over 2,000 years ago, Hippocrates urged that physicians of the day take note of the airs, the waters, the surroundings of their patients, and the seasons, considering their state of health or illness. But while Western societies took the path of exploitation and domination to support increasing human needs and desires over past centuries, Indigenous peoples around the world maintained this sense of connection, even as their territories have been diminished or destroyed, and they have suffered centuries of colonization and oppression. So Indigenous communities in Canada and around the world continue to be disproportionately afflicted by environmental hazards and injustices linked to systemic racism, and Indigenous peoples continue to be targeted in their attempts to protect their lands, but have also developed in their wisdom, resilience, and planetary health knowledge. And we must recognize that any actions moving forward must be in collaboration with Indigenous communities, learning from Indigenous resilience and expertise in planetary health in order to promote the health of our shared planetary home for the benefit of all future generations. So how did this come about? Let's talk a little bit about where this comes from. In the past 200 years or so since the Industrial Revolution, when refinement of the steam engine led to a massive upsurge in coal production for transport and energy, our capacity to exploit the Earth's resources increased exponentially, along with our increasing reliance on fossil fuels, so things like oil and gas and coal, that allowed us to flatten mountains, to divert and dredge rivers, to clear forests, to acidify oceans, to deposit chemical and solid waste into soils, air, and water, to devastate our fish stocks, to trigger antimicrobial resistance, and to send plastics to weave their way into our ecosystems, our rivers and streams, and deep down into our bodies, our bloodstreams, and even into the placentas nourishing the newborn. During much of this time, environmental science and medicine took separate paths, each developing extensive fields of research, one concerned with ills of the ecosystems, flora and fauna, etc., and the other diagnosing and treating diseases, increasingly successful in combating once fatal illnesses and making remarkable gains over morbidity and mortality. Western medicine forgot the advice of Hippocrates and increasingly focused on treating disease without considering the context of the person within their environment. So while we have seen significant advances in many indicators of human health and well-being over the past century, thanks to these advances, we neglected to look outside and notice the cost of these on our ecosystems and our planet's capacity to withstand the consequences, but also on human health itself. So human-driven changes have profoundly affected planetary systems function to the point where they are approaching or have surpassed planetary limits, and thus are affecting health and well-being of humans both now and in the future. We fail to notice that even in our healthcare systems, we have ironically contributed in no small part to the burden on planetary well-being. These accelerating environmental changes have disrupted the planetary conditions humans have relied on over time that allowed us to thrive and to multiply. Climate change, global pollution, biodiversity loss, land use, industrial agriculture, ultra-processed foods are driving large burdens of diseases on every dimension of human, physical, mental, and spiritual health. What is COVID-19 if not a result of disruption to our environment? One of only a number of infectious diseases linked to human and animal contact. So even before COVID came barreling in, the other global epidemic, that of chronic diseases, was increasing in magnitude across all countries, though huge health inequalities mean that the burden of these illnesses falls unfairly on those with least access to resources. So things like cardiovascular, respiratory disease, cancers, diabetes, mental health, allergies, etc., kill over 40 million people a year globally. Many of these NCDs are closely linked to, if not directly caused by, environmental factors. So air pollution, for example, from fine particles from fossil fuel combustion is responsible for an estimated 4.2 million deaths and millions more lifelong disabilities globally, and in Canada alone is responsible for over 14,000 premature deaths per year, not far from the approximately 19,000 Canadians who have died from COVID up till now. And, you know, ironically, COVID lockdowns actually did improve air quality. The urgency of climate change has brought clarity to our human ecosystem connections and a global consciousness of human life at stake from a menace caused by ourselves, and with increasing evidence that no one is immune. Planetary health is still an emerging discipline, and it is working in a very collaborative way on finding and acting on solutions locally and globally to respond to the ecological and climate disruption, to undo the harm and to create a viable desired future. That humans only thrive when all animal and plant systems thrive. The Planetary Health Alliance, based at Harvard University, has over 200 member organizations around the world, NGOs and other organizations with a mission to support the rapid growth of this field. And a subgroup of this is Clinicians for Planetary Health, which meets virtually, exchanging ideas, brainstorming clinical practice initiatives. Nurses are definitely part of this, and there is certainly a need for everybody. Just to an example, Dr. Teddy Potter is a newly appointed Director of Planetary Health in the School of Nursing at the University of Minnesota, with planetary health there as a core aspect of curriculum, introducing planetary health education into all levels of the nursing curriculum, from undergrad to doctoral studies, supporting projects to prepare future nurses to address human needs and planetary health, and co-teaching with faculty from a multiplicity of other disciplines that they don't traditionally do teaching with. She's also been involved in core competencies for the Planetary Health Alliance, which will be due out this spring. Her students have recorded a video of the Planetary Health Pledge, and the link is on my last slide. So now we have the newly formed McGill Nurses for Planetary Health, giving us a pathway forward and a possibility for connections with like-minded people across multiple disciplines and origins, here at McGill, but everywhere else across the globe. When we have a multi-system failure, it takes everyone to work together in finding solutions to solve the issues and create conditions for future thriving. I invite you should join us. The future lies there. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop my...
Thank you so much.
Stop my share.
Sorry. So thank you so much, Fiona. That was really great. Everything you said, perfect. So now we have, as our second speaker, we have Hilah Silver. She's a perinatal nurse and member of Extinction Rebellion. She's a graduate student at the Department of Family Medicine at McGill University, and she's working with Inuit midwives and families on a participatory project to support family-centered and cultural safe childbirth. So Fiona, I will give you the floor.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. I'm not quite as organized as Fiona is. I don't have a PowerPoint or anything. I just wanted to sort of share some of the, I guess, insights or thoughts that I had when it comes to the question that this event is all about. So why do nurses need to advocate for environmental and Indigenous justice? And I think in trying to answer that question, actually another sort of question came to me at the same time, which is not just why, but also how, because I think a lot of the folks that are here with us today already maybe have some sort of a sense of why that's important, but I think many of us sometimes tend to feel a little bit lost about, well, how do we actually make this happen? How do we make this a reality? And so I wanted to share some of the thoughts that I've had that have come to me over the last couple of years. Specifically, though, I want to address environmental and Indigenous justice in so-called Canada, specifically where we are, because I think that the land on which we stand and the context, the political context in which we live, has very specific implications for how we move forward. And I think the main sort of conclusion that I came to is that living in so-called Canada, we cannot separate environmental justice from Indigenous justice struggles. We need to fight for both of them simultaneously. And I think nurses actually have an incredible amount of privilege and power in contributing to this struggle. And so when I first looked at this question that Naomi, you had sent as being the topic of this discussion today, the first sort of thing that came to my mind, well, why should nurses advocate for the environment? And I think Fiona did a wonderful job of sort of laying out the scope of that, right? Since nursing is theoretically about preventing illness and protecting health, nurses need to act against environmental destruction, right? And its effect on people's health. And so I think everybody here with us tonight gets that environmental destruction and the climate crisis is bad for people's health. And we understand that we need to fight for a cleaner and healthier environment for everybody. What I think sometimes is sort of lacking still from sort of the mainstream nursing discourse in Canada and also elsewhere in the world is still, well, how does environmental justice or environmental destruction, what does that have to do with justice for Indigenous people? And I think really when we live in a place like Canada, environmental destruction goes hand in hand with the destruction of Indigenous people because Canada is an extractivist settler state, right? So an extractivist state is one that derives all of its power from and also depends on natural resource extraction. So the wealth comes from extracting from the land. Canada is, I think, the fourth largest fossil fuel producer in the world, right? All of our state power, our economic power under capitalism depends on getting access to natural resources and extracting them out to market. But Canada is also simultaneously a colonial state. And so given that our state power comes from extracting profits, but because we are a settler colony, we come up against the fact that the land that we're always trying to extract our resources from, well, that land is occupied by Indigenous people. And so Indigenous people in the eyes of the state are just in the way of that access to resources and wealth. And so that leaves Indigenous people really facing kind of two options the way I understand it. They can either accept capitalist-driven resource extraction and bear the consequences of the environmental damage to their bodies, to their communities, and to their territories. And again, Fiona kind of really went through the extent of which that happens, from how that affects our air, our water, our land, and our bodies, and even the bodies of our unborn children, right? Or if they don't accept it, they can try to resist it. And this is where they risk being literally destroyed by the government. And I think there are many examples of these two different paths that Indigenous people face when coming against the extractivist power of the government. And I think very recent in the last few years, we see a lot of times what does tend to happen to communities that do stand up and try and resist is the physical violence and attacks on people, not just on their bodies, but also on their lands as well. And so what Indigenous resistance shows us is that the government will actually stop at nothing to get to the natural resources that they want, right? Even if it means destroying Indigenous lands and bodies in the process. And so whichever way communities choose to go, whether it's accepting the extraction that happens and then bearing those health consequences or trying to resist, it is Indigenous people that are first and foremost the ones to be hurt. And so in Canada, this is where it becomes really clear that environmental destruction is inseparable from the destruction of Indigenous people. And so when we look at it this way, it leads us to the conclusion that if destruction of the environment happens simultaneously and around the destruction of Indigenous people, right, we cannot fight these two things separately. When we're fighting for environmental justice, we have to fight for Indigenous justice at the same time. And so what does this mean really for nurses? And that kind of leads me to the second part of the question that Naomi, you had given us to sort of think through. And I think that nurses actually have an incredible amount of privilege to fight for Indigenous and environmental justice, both within the healthcare institutions and outside them. And with that privilege, I think also comes the responsibility to act on both fronts, right? So to act both as nurses within the healthcare system and then as allies also on the outside. And so when thinking about, well, what does it mean to act as a nurse within the system, I think the biggest fight is to fight for safe and equitable care for Indigenous peoples. Our healthcare system, in my eyes, functions sort of in damage control mode, right? So we provide what I see as being largely very reactive care to illness and injury and not tending to focus enough on preventative care, right? So we react to the effects of environmental or climate destruction but not so much on the underlying causes. So we'll treat asthma and we'll treat heart disease, but we don't treat the air pollution that causes them. We treat dehydration and preterm labor and heat stroke, but not the heat waves or the rising temperatures that are associated with them. And so in that, when we look at our system from this perspective, we also need to consider another point, which is that the care that we do provide, this reactive type of care, serves some people better than others. And the people that are treated better in our healthcare system are almost never Indigenous people, right? And there's so many commissions and inquiries and deaths of Indigenous people that prove that. And so Indigenous people, on the one hand, bear disproportionate health impacts of environmental destruction, and on the other hand, receive the most compromised care when seeking healing or support or safety for the impacts that they've experienced. So I think at a minimum, we need to ensure that they have access to safe and equitable care when they walk in the doors of a healthcare institution, in order just to be able to address even the most primary or basic consequences of the destruction that's going on. And so very concretely, one way I think that nurses can support this, first of all, is making sure that Joyce's principle does get adopted. So for those of you maybe who haven't been reading the news that much lately, but Joyce's principle was created by the Katsi'tsakwas First Nation, and this was following the death of Joyce Echaquan due to systemic anti-racism in the Quebec healthcare system. And so the principle lays out very clearly the steps that need to be taken to provide safe and equitable care to Indigenous people. And those steps are outlined for whether you are a hospital or a university or a governmental body. Okay. And I think a second thing that we need to think of it when we're working in institutions as nurses is to really work on practicing solidarity and bringing environmental and Indigenous justice struggles together when we're working within hospitals, because I think a lot of times we tend to be separate. We have nurses sort of working for the environment on one hand, and a lot of times nurses working for Indigenous or anti-racist issues on the other. And I think a great sort of potential that we have is when we actually bring these fights together, because it's great to have a green committee that recycles and reduces waste in the hospital, but if it's carrying out anti-racist anti-Indigenous care practices and policies, we're leaving a major mechanism of injustice unaddressed, right? And so bringing these fights together, I think, holds a lot more potential for actually trying to change the underlying injustices. And so that's, I think, for me, these sort of like initial ways of thinking, okay, well, as a nurse, what do I do to try and support the struggle for justice? And that's on the inside. And then on the outside of the healthcare institutions, this is where nurses as citizens really need to join the struggle to address the root causes of these injustices. And so that means joining mass movements, engaging in civil disobedience, joining land back initiatives. You know, it really means needing to fight the root causes, which are capitalism and colonialism outside of the healthcare establishment as well. And this is where I think our privilege and responsibilities as nurses lie, is that we're uniquely placed to be able to work both as nurses to provide strength and safety and healing to those who are on the front lines of defending our lands and our air and our water. And then we get to leave work and go join them in solidarity on the front lines as allies. And so I really think that with this type of privilege that we have also comes great responsibility. And when I think about how we can join in our struggles together, it gives me a lot of hope for where this fight might go. So thank you.
Thank you so much, so inspiring. So now it is my true honor to introduce Ellen Gabriel, who is an Indigenous human rights and environmental activist since the 1990s. She was chosen by the people of the Longhouse and her community of Katsi'tsakwas to be their spokesperson during the 1990 Oka crisis. She is an active board member of Gundenonstadt, sorry for my pronunciation, Mohawk Language Custodian Association, and is a steering committee member with Indigenous Climate Action. She has advocated for the rights of Indigenous peoples, presenting at the Quebec National Assembly, Parliamentary and Senate committees at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues since 2004, and the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, advocating for Indigenous peoples' human rights, self-determination, cultural and language rights, the issues of violence against Indigenous women, and climate change. So I pass it to you, Ellen.
Naomi, Segusewago, what Conwarado, Katsi'tsakwas na yujat Tanwaganyatu, Tano Kanyakahaga, don't the Tanugana Sadaga Ganagere, what Conwarado, and so Aguagutidas Kungarawi. Thank you, everybody. My Mohawk name is Katsi'tsakwas, or Kanyakaha name. I am a board member of Kuntinustats. Mohawk language was only standardized and begun standardizations in the 1970s, since it's an oral language. So I appreciate, Naomi, your effort. It's a difficult language to learn, let alone read. So I thank you for your effort. It's a great privilege and honor to be here with all of you here today. Thank you, Fiona, for your brilliant presentation. It's great to see that nurses in your leadership have such a strong mentor and acknowledgement of the environment and its importance to people's health. And thank you, Hilah, for the strong advocacy and support for Indigenous people. As you were all presenting, I don't have a formal presentation, but as you were presenting, I was thinking about the fact that, I mean, nurses have a huge job as it is to care for patients in their day-to-day, and with the cuts to healthcare, it's really important that you also have time for yourselves. So in your fight for advocacy for others also, it's time for self-care for yourselves as well. So I do appreciate this wonderful initiative that you have all undertaken. There have been numerous commissions and reports that could help nurses and other healthcare professionals in implementing the kind of curriculum needed so that there is no more deaths like Katsi'tsakwas, so that people understand that colonialism is very much the praxis of the relationship between Canada, the settler state, and Indigenous people. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples took 5 years to undertake and came from the 1990 Katsi'tsakwas siege. It's always, we're always reacting in many senses to crisis. And we are all living under many crises right now, the pandemic being the most paramount to us right now. But the UN declared, I think in December, that every single state on this planet has 6 years to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions that they are spewing out into the atmosphere. We've been talking about this for decades, and we're still talking about it today because the fossil fuel industry, which controls most of the governments and upon which most of the hardship that Indigenous people face is due to, the fossil fuel industry, and the fact that Canada needs to be a contender in the world stage, so they need the oil to create this economy, has always been at the expense of Indigenous people's health and safety. And with climate change, the impacts of climate change creating a shorter or a smaller amount of resources as time goes by, those who are marginalized and already vulnerable will be even more so as time progresses. So we got to come up with some quick solutions. We've got to start doing some solutions amongst ourselves. We need to demand better quality products that we're going to be buying as consumers. We're all consumers, whether we're Indigenous or not. But also to have a human rights-based approach that includes an environmental rights-based approach. So for Indigenous people, the earth is our mother. So we are supposed to be protecting, we're supposed to be honoring our mother, we're supposed to be protecting her because, you know, really, she can live without us. We can't live without her. And so Indigenous people who have been at the forefront of environmental protection are only now getting recognition and validation for all those ancestral teachings that have been given to us that teach us how to live sustainably, how to live responsibly, and how to live respectfully with the earth and the environment. So in my introduction, I said I'm Turtle Clan. So we have stories in Iroquois culture that the clans really are, we come from those animals of which our clans are based upon. So there were turtle people who evolved into the human beings that we are today, which is why I'm a Turtle Clan. There is so many stories in various Indigenous peoples' cultures that teach us, you could call them myths, as Joseph Campbell calls them, but for us, they're ways of survival. They're ways of teaching you to understand the importance from the insect to the waters to everything. Everything is interdependent, interconnected. You know, right now we're having a warm winter in spite of, you know, the -13 temperatures that we're having. When I was a kid, there was tons of snow. It was cold, but we were outside as children because, you know, coming from a family like mine, my mother said, go outside and play. We weren't allowed to sit in front of the TV. We were supposed to, and we didn't have the video games. We didn't have the, you know, VHS machines. So we were always outside and we got to know our environment. We got to know the land. And I feel very privileged to have been able to do that. Something which I think the children of today don't really quite have that understanding or that privilege, simply because so many invasive species are killing the indigenous plants and the indigenous trees of this part of the land. So let's talk about decolonizing. So what does decolonization mean? Well, decolonization means that we understand that we are not separate from the environment, that we are part of the environment. And nurses' roles in this is to be witness to what you are seeing in your day-to-day routines in caring for patients. As Fiona and Hilah mentioned, there is a lot of diseases that are environmentally related. There's a lot of things that nurses should be allowed the freedom to be able to express either to doctors, to other medical boards, and to government, and to be part of the solution. Not just, we shouldn't just see nurses in the hospitals. We should see nurses in parliamentary committees. We should see nurses at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples to help validate the concerns of threats to our health that the Indigenous peoples have been talking about for so long. We must all work together, and that means bringing your expertise into the advocacy of the health and well-being of Indigenous people and the planet, as you are doing today. When we think about peace, dignity, tolerance, freedom, equality, and solidarity, these are things that children under the rights, the Convention for the Rights of the Child, and even under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talk about. I mean, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about childhood as being very special in a person's life. We are supposed to be doing things for those ones who are babies and who are toddlers right now and who don't have the power to make the change or express or understand the changes that are going on. We are supposed to be doing it for the 7 generations, their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. If we allow governments to continue to push things under the table or to the side to say that this is an Indigenous issue, this is a Black, Indigenous, people of color issue, and separate it from what is considered mainstream, then there's really not, there's really no hope. There really is no hope. What I think needs to be understood is that Indigenous people, as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People says it's in its preamble, because of historical injustices, because of racist doctrines that have oppressed us and allowed genocide to continue, because of that, Indigenous people are the most marginalized, they are the most vulnerable. So we need to connect human rights with what is going on in contemporary life in Canada, in Quebec. When you separate the two, when you continue to put us over here, that means only government is addressing the issues that concern Indigenous people. If you're going to say that Indigenous people have a right to self-determination, and in that right to self-determination, we have the right to a healthy environment. We have a right to equality whenever we're sick. We have a right to be able to be heard, and not just to the Minister of Indian Affairs, who really could give 2 hoots about us anyways, because they're so busy trying to assimilate us that, you know, the only thing that they care about are titles. What is your title? If you're a chief, oh, then you must have God's divine knowledge put into your brain right away, right after the election. Well, I can tell you that the people who I noticed you put something about Ganesadaga talking about a lawsuit. Well, those people who are doing the lawsuit have the resources that traditional people or land defenders don't have. The land defenders are the ones who are protecting the land, not the ones who are sitting in comfortable offices. And so you have to discern between who is an actual land defender and who isn't a government agent. And to be able to do that, you have to understand the complexity of the issues that have been caused by colonization that is the part of the reality of Indigenous people in our communities. And it's not to take away from what they're doing, but as a land defender who's been doing this for quite some time, I can tell you that last summer, facing archaeological digs and facing the continued urban sprawl development and the tourism industry in Oka, in Ganasabage. Last year was one of the most brutal years that I've ever had. And that is because of the pandemic. The pandemic did not allow people to come out to support us. So we need to put things into context. You need to study and understand those reports that talk about where we've come from, why we're here today, and where we would like to go. That's all part of a trauma-informed lens that is needed and which nurses have more access to than the ordinary person. So when we think about the planet, when we think about what we need as a species to continue, we need to be able to understand each other much better than we have been in the past. I mean, these webinars have been amazing things. I mean, I don't have to drive in my car, neither does anybody else. We just sit in front of a computer and we discuss things, but that takes away from the interpersonal relationship because we're very social, we're social beings. I'm an introvert, to be honest, so this is kind of really my safe space. But I do miss the interpersonal contact. If we also factor in, and this is something that I want to say, is that, you know, when Minister Miller talks about Indigenous people will be on the list of priority I'm not sure what the exact word is, but we're on the priority to get the vaccine because of the history of disease and etc. Yet we are not a priority when it comes to our health or a healthy environment. This is just optics for people to think that, you know, yes, you know, after, like, as the first UN Special Rapporteur, Rodolfo Stovenhagen said in his first report on Indigenous peoples, after in the Americas, after 1 century of contact with Europeans, 3/4 of the Indigenous population in the Americas were wiped out from war and disease. And so this is something that the colonizer uses, oh, we got to protect the Indigenous people. And so there's all kinds of conspiracy theories, which I don't appreciate when people start sending me stuff like, the pandemic is not real, the pandemic is actually, and the vaccine is going to create different kinds of, you know, mutations. I think what really people need to understand is that this is real, whether it was genetically manufactured, whether it was from nature, we don't know. Nobody can say for sure. We just know people are dying. We just know that people are getting ill. And Indigenous people do not trust any government institution when it comes to whether it's our health, education, or anything else. But the whole issue that I want to lead back to, and I'm sorry for that tangent, is that we are survivors of a genocide. We are multi-generational survivors of genocide. And I'm sorry, I don't have the person who said this, but genocide is death by 1,000,000 paper cuts. I think Samir might know this. I think I might have gotten this quote from him. And that's really got to hurt, because 1 paper cut, I think, is enough. 1 paper cut is, but 1,000,000 of them is devastating. I think we need to start really as a species to start understanding that we are the cause of our own demise, and that if we are not allowed the freedom to express our truth, if we allow governments to continue to hide the truth and to make it an easy out for the general population not to have to address the issues of Indigenous peoples and our efforts to protect the environment, because we know from our ancestral teachings that if we don't, we are all going to become extinct. If we allow governments to continue to ride on the coattails of previous generations who have spoken out, much like a painful speaking out. You know, Indigenous leaders have faced and have been forced to feel the brunt of the colonizers' foot on our heads. And we're tired. We are tired of it. So we need your help. And as nurses, you are there to see us through those times of whether it's a violent situation, whether it's a child who has come to you for whatever reason, an elder who is sick, it doesn't matter. We as a human species or population have always been meant to feel that we are not important, that we are the disposable people. And for your efforts today, it makes us feel that we're not disposable according to your association, your profession. And you need to tell your government that, and you need to tell not just the federal government, but the provincial and municipal governments. We need your help. We don't want you to walk ahead of us. We don't want you to speak for us. We want you to walk side by side with us to create the kind of social justice I think that everybody wants to have, but is sorely lacking. And so I will end it there because I know you have 2 more speakers. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for the invitation. Tony Kawanega.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And as a young nurse, I feel so empowered by your speech. So I'm just gonna share that. So yeah, so for this another speaker, we have Mr. Samir Shaheen-Hussain. He has been involved in anti-authoritarian social justice movement, including indigenous solidarity, anti-police brutality, and migrant justice for nearly 2 decades. He is a member of a Caring for Social Justice Collective and has written or co-written about state violence and healthcare for several publications. In fact, he is the author of the book Fighting for a Hand to Hold, Confronting Medical Colonialism Against Indigenous Children in Canada. He is also an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine at McGill University and works as a pediatric emergency physician in Jojage, Montreal. So, Mr. Shaheen-Hussain, so Samir, I'll pass it to you. I'll just stop sharing so you can share.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm just gonna bring up my screen here. So, folks can see it? Good. Okay, so yes, thank you for the introduction, Rosemary, and to Naomi for both of you and others involved in organizing this, and thanks for the invitation. I think it's really great that there's you know, this new group that's basically getting set up at McGill. It's really important, and certainly the speakers that we've heard so far provide an important framework for the work, hopefully, that you will be able to continue. I should say that sometimes people joke that, you know, at demonstrations and at talks, panel events like this, that no one wants to go after Ellen Gabriel. Now I understand why, but I'll do what I can to talk about another kind of element that I do think is important on this about this issue of planetary health. So in terms of just quick objectives, I basically want to provide an overview of the 2018 A Hand to Hold campaign, understand how medical colonialism and anti-Indigenous systemic racism persist in healthcare provision today, and explore the links between colonial policies, health, and healthcare provision through a social and environmental justice lens. I have no conflicts of interest to declare, except of course that, as Rosemary mentioned, I wrote this book. All the royalties for the book, all my author's royalties are already pre-designated for organization. I'm not a cent of any of the book sales. So these are the organizations the royalties are going to. one other thing I would like to highlight is that it's my name that appears on the cover, but I had, tried to push my publisher to make sure that Cindy Blackstock and Ellen's name is also on the cover, but that I didn't win that battle, unfortunately. But I think it's really important for anyone who's going to read the book that they recognize Cindy and Ellen's contributions, because Cindy wrote the foreword and Ellen wrote the afterword. And I really consider both of their contributions as being a core part of the book. I would have written the book differently had they not made their contributions. So it really needs to be seen as part of the book and not just an add-on. And then before going on, I would also like to acknowledge all the families that basically came out in support of the A Hand to Hold campaign in 2008. It takes a lot of courage to be able to speak out and denounce an injustice, particularly an injustice that a loved child is going through. And these families did that, and that provided a significant amount of, basically provided the soul to the campaign in many respects. And without their interventions and courage, the campaign would certainly not have succeeded. So I'm not going to go over the campaign too much, but just to give people who aren't familiar with the situation at the time, I'm just going to give a very quick overview. So basically, up until 2018, in the province of Quebec, there was a practice that was in place that forced parents or caregivers or prevented parents or caregivers from accompanying their kids during emergency medevac airlifts. And this applied actually across the province to all children requiring emergency medevac airlifts. But Indigenous children, particularly those from Northern Quebec, were disproportionately impacted. And just for sake of time, I can't go into all the details of why, but a lot of the things that people have already mentioned earlier, Fiona, Hilah, Ellen, explain why. A lot of these things have to do with structural determinants of health, have to do with colonial policies that have basically trickle-down effects on children's health and well-being. And that, for example, made it more likely for these children in Northern Quebec from EU and Inuit communities to need to be medevaced in the first place. And so this was, for example, one of the reasons why these communities were disproportionately impacted. But you can imagine at the level of a child, who may never have flown before, how traumatizing this must have been, going onto a plane without a parent or caregiver, surrounded by nursing and medical personnel that they've never seen, oftentimes who don't speak the same language, and then brought down to the emergency department where more people would basically poke and prod at them, and being kept away from the parent or caregiver for at least hours, in many cases days, until their parent or caregiver can finally come back and rejoin them once they've been able to take the next commercial flight available to them. And so this practice had been going on since the 1980s, despite many Indigenous communities actually calling out this practice and demanding change from at least the early 1990s. And that didn't happen, despite the fact that across the country, all other pediatric centers basically either allowed or encouraged children to be accompanied by their parent or caregiver for medevac airlifts. So all to say, in that context, in January of 2018, we basically, healthcare providers at the Montreal Children's Hospital launched the A Hand to Hold campaign to put an end to this practice. There was a lot of public support, a lot of media coverage. And after a long, protracted, I guess, battle of sorts, the government finally changed its position and instituted an actual policy that allowed caregivers to accompany their kids. And this was actually the first kid from Nunavik who was allowed to be accompanied by his mother in July of 2018. All of this came not without, a lot of difficulties. There was a lot of resistance from the government. There was a lot of bad faith, a lot of broken promises, as is always the case whenever colonial governments, as has already been mentioned, deal with Indigenous communities. I'm just going to share a quick 2-minute video that I have queued up here. And I'll just talk about it right after, but it gives you a good overview of a lot of the issues that were at play. So hopefully the sound will come through.
A rule that prevented sick children from traveling with their parents aboard medevac flights has been widely criticized in Quebec. After recent pushback, the government yielded and promised to let parents on board. At a community event at this mosque, the health minister was asked why that hasn't happened yet. CBC obtained a recording of his response, where he guaranteed someone intoxicated will be kicked off of a flight in the next 6 months.
Where someone will not be made not allowed to get on the plane. Why? Because no one agitated, drunk, under whatever influence would get on the plane. Any problems. That will not happen. That happens all the time.
Those words led to a chorus of condemnation.
To have comments like that by a minister is totally appalling and unacceptable. We're going to demand that the minister resign from his position.
The head of an organization that represents Inuit in Quebec's north says he needs to apologize, and I don't think that will be enough. He needs to go. The trust is gone. Barrette backpedaled today, at first saying that people wrongly assumed he'd been talking about Indigenous people when he meant it more generally. Then, later, he offered this as an apology.
I can understand the sensitivity of that and the reaction. I apologize for that. I'm quite sorry about that, but at the end of the day, can we move on?
The Premier is standing in solidarity with his health minister as a provincial election looms.
I think he's sorry that his words have been interpreted that way. I suggest that we leave it there.
Barrette did call the mayor of Kuujjuaq to apologize. The mayor says he does not accept the apology. He's demanding that the minister resign immediately. Jayla Bernstein, CBC News, Montreal.
I'm just going to go back to my screen here. So I share that for a few reasons. You know, one is obviously that you know, Barrette says at one point, you know, at the end of the day, can we move on? And as those who have spoken already have mentioned, you know, there's a long-standing history of colonial violence and genocide in Quebec and in Canada. And so with that context, we can't just move on, right? That's just not possible. And the other reason I share this is because obviously the comments that Barrette made, the initial comments, essentially perpetuate one of these many tropes, these racist tropes that are used, stereotypes that are used against Indigenous people. And here, this is the one of the quote unquote drunken Indian, where he basically said, you know, that he can guarantee that there's going to be someone who's going to be agitated, drugged, or under whatever influence. But Barrette also used other tropes during the campaign. In May of 2018, in response to a question at the National Assembly by an opposition leader, asking why this practice was still ongoing and why things hadn't changed, and particularly why, if the issue was possibly a technical issue, why the government couldn't just get another plane to ensure caregiver accompaniment. Barrette basically replied saying, you know, the government basically has decisions to make, and the one that they've made is the most rational within our budgetary capacity. And this decision at the time was basically that of, you know, possibly changing one of the planes, because there's 2 Challenger planes that prevented parental accompaniment. So modifying one of the planes, but then leaving the other one intact, mainly because it would just cost too much, which in the end didn't end up being true anyway. But this was the excuse that was given at the time. And I highlight this, in fact, one of the mothers of a child who was transferred alone from Nunavik kind of highlighted the absurdity of this comment, of his position of cost, right? So she basically said, you know, when a child dies, like far away from their parents, how much does that cost? You can't put a cost on that and on dignified healthcare. But there's another issue with all this as well. And the other issue is, and this is where I'm kind of trying to take a step back, and I talk about this in the book, to give a bigger, a wider lens approach to this issue, in order to understand how preposterous it was for the health minister at the time to invoke budgetary constraints as a reason that would potentially prevent Indigenous children from Northern Quebec to be allowed to be accompanied during emergency medical air evacuations. And that issue is that, Hydro-Quebec, basically, the first major project, which was called the Project of the Century in the early 1970s, was the James Bay Project, which effectively sought to, dam, divert rivers, flood lands in Iwishi and in Nunavik. That was going to have enormous, and has had enormous implications for those communities in Northern Quebec. So the very same communities that we're talking about now that are disproportionately impacted by this practice were essentially targeted for the exploitation of natural resources. And in this case, we're talking about natural resources as being essentially water. This is a chart from a 2018 report from Hydro-Quebec. And essentially, if you kind of break down the numbers, what it shows is that half of Hydro-Quebec's hydroelectricity, half of it is generated on Iu, Inuit, and Escapi territories. Another third of their hydroelectricity is generated on Innu land. And so, when we're talking about the electricity that's used in Quebec, that's coming from these projects that have had huge implications for these Indigenous communities. And at the same time, what's happened is that because Hydro-Quebec is a nationalized utility, enormous funds basically from their profits go into the Quebec government coffers. And so essentially what ends up happening is that the Quebec government and therefore settler society essentially continues to benefit from this expropriation of land that has occurred 30, 40 years ago now. So Hydro-Quebec, this is again from a 2018 report, talks about more than 99% of Hydro-Quebec's power output is clean and renewable. And so the question is, clean and renewable for whom? Because it certainly wasn't clean, nor was it renewable for many of the communities in Northern Quebec at the time, and certainly now. At the time when the project was happening, there were reports of people going out onto the land, and one Iu or Cree elder basically expressed how they were reacting in a way as though it seemed that someone they loved had died. This is what people were reporting at the time. And after the project took place in the late 70s and 1980s, there were widespread reports of the fish being contaminated, and therefore of people who would fish also becoming contaminated with mercury and other toxins, to the point where Hydro-Quebec at one point even suggested not to fish in the rivers and to fish in James and Hudson Bays instead. So again, when we're talking about clean and renewable, it's that question of who is this clean and renewable for? This is a quote from Paul Dixon, who is the director of the Cree Trappers Association, who basically said, this is kind of how he describes exploitation when we're talking about extractive industries that Hilah was mentioning, but Fiona and Ellen obviously also talk about, is the land is left in ruins and they call it wealth. That's basically what a capitalist economy predicated on resource extraction, what its modus operandi is. That's basically how it sees the world essentially. And so at the end of the day, profiting from the land has always been the core of the colonial project, whether hundreds of years ago or today. and inequalities in healthcare follow the fault lines of societal injustices. And so long as there are societal injustices, inequalities in healthcare will persist. There's one line that I wanted to share from a former pediatric resident of mine who had gotten in touch a few weeks after the campaign was launched. And she basically said, I can't even recall all the times in my residency that I was in a situation where this policy affected a child I was taking care of. We knew it was the rule, we knew it was awful, and yet we just kept going. And ultimately, the point of the book, hopefully the point of organizations and new groups like this, is basically to say that we just can't keep going anymore. And the consequences of this are significant, because unless we put a stop to the current status quo, cases like Joyce Echaquan that has already been mentioned, who suffered this brutal death in the context of horrific racist treatment that she received at Joliette Hospital in September of 2020, unless things change, those kinds of violences are basically going to keep continuing. And so ultimately, as has already been mentioned, this is a question of kind of taking it to the streets, going outside of our walls, and linking with essentially people's social justice movements to put an end to these inequalities, injustices, and this level of violence. There's one last slide I just want to share before I'm going to end. Give me a second. And it's basically, I guess, my answer in a way, or my perhaps suggestion or recommendation of how things potentially can move forward with this new group. And this is a line that had an influence on me years ago, and it was a quote from Indigenous activists in Queensland, Australia years ago. Basically said, if you've come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I hope that the spirit of solidarity that comes from out of this quote is going to be something that will inspire others as you continue your important work. Thank you.
I don't think you give yourself enough credit, because that was amazing. So finally, last but not least, our final speaker is Professor Richard Budgell. He's an associate professor of Inuit and Northern Health Promotion in the Department of Family Medicine. He has a background of more than 30 years as a public servant with the Government of Canada. He has a bachelor's degree in history and linguistics at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and his master's degree in Canadian Studies, Indigenous concentration at Carleton University. He's developing and teaching Indigenous course material, conducting research, and participating in Indigenous recruitment. I pass it to you.
Hello. So I'm going to set up my screen here. Hold on. I'm almost getting used to how to do this. I've done it a few times now, so I'm almost getting used to it. Let me see. So does that do it? Sorry. No. What could I be doing wrong?
You have to go on Zoom, and then there should be a tab at the top or at the bottom.
Yeah, share screen.
With share screen, and then you click.
Yeah, that is what I'm doing. What am I? That's funny, we did that successfully before.
Have you chosen like the one you want and then share it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there multiple tabs within the tab that you want to share? You might have to delete the other ones.
This is the only presentation that's there. Hold to select. I don't want to select multiple windows. I want to select one. And wait.
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that. So hello, everybody. It's an honor to go after such an impressive group of speakers, and it's a little daunting. So I'll do my best. So many interesting points from all of you. Samir, you say you should never go after Ellen Gabriel. I would say never go after Samir, because that's also a little intimidating. On the hydro question, one of the things that I say to my family in Labrador and Newfoundland, the first time I ever benefited from the Churchill Falls hydro deal was when I moved to Quebec, moved to Montreal 6 years ago. First time I ever benefited from it, because we are all beneficiaries of that, with the cheapest hydro in North America, and we owe that to the Inuit, the Cree, the Innu, the Naskapi. That is who we owe it to. So we should remind ourselves in our lovely warm homes here, that's who we owe it to. I'm going to be talking a couple of angles here that I hope touch on the central questions for tonight. So I want to talk about nursing in an Inuit context, nursing in Inuit communities, and I also want to talk about Inuit nurses, because that is something that we're relatively unaware of, because it is so uncommon. But so I want to talk about a couple of angles there, and I'm going to move as quickly as I can through this because I don't want to keep people late. So this is the Inuit homeland, for those of you who are not already familiar with it. Inuit Nunangat, 53 communities spread across a distance of from the furthest west, Tuktoyaktuk, to the furthest east and southeast, the community of Rigolet, which happens to be the community that my father grew up in. 3,900 kilometers between those two communities. Population in 2016 of 65,000. To note, though, that increasingly the population, Inuit population, is becoming somewhat urbanized. So in the case of Montreal, for example, in 2016, about 1,200, 1,200 Inuit living in Montreal. That has certainly increased since that time. So Montreal may in fact become the largest or the second largest Inuit community in Quebec. So important for everyone to remember that, in fact, Inuit also live outside of Inuit Nunangat, outside of the homeland. So 53 communities. I want to talk about what's the problematique here. What is the issue in relation to Inuit and nursing? So a number of points here. Long tradition in relation to Inuit women, in particular, of their roles as plural, as caregivers, healers, midwives. That hasn't translated very well, or in most cases, into Inuit becoming nurses. Although, just to make the point, in Nunavik and elsewhere, this is something that Hilah is very familiar with, there are now increasingly well-established centers of midwifery, staffed by many Inuit midwives, so that there is some obvious strength in relation to that tradition becoming accepted in a Western clinical context. Nursing shortages across the jurisdictions of Inuit Nunangat, and then the reality that most nurses in the Inuit homeland are Halunat, non-Inuit. So hard to find clear numbers about this, but I found one number from 2009, only 3% of nurses in Nunavut are Inuit. So in Nunavut, that, in the territory, more than 90% of the population is Inuit, but in fact, only 3% of the nurses working in the health facilities in the territory are Inuit. That complicates the issue of cultural safety for patients and does not help to move towards the indigenization of medical and health practices in health facilities. Because if you start with people who are very unfamiliar with the communities and the cultural context of where they are working, those professionals have to be educated. That is, part of my role now in family medicine to help develop education for Kalanat professionals. Inuit are frequently very welcoming and welcome having those professionals, but there is this additional barrier certainly that people need to, have that additional education to learn really how to practice appropriately. There is nevertheless an alienation between Inuit and the healthcare system, because inevitably, if you see a system that is staffed by people with whom you have a weaker relationship, people who are not part of your collectivity, then that is inherently a bit alienating, you can say inherently a bit colonialist. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. Now, this for young nurses may be a kind of a shocking image, but I'm showing this to you deliberately because this woman was part of my family. This woman was my very dear Aunt Rina. Her name was Rina McLean. She became a nurse in 1960. She was trained in a tradition of colonial medicine. So in our home community of Northwest River, my mother's home community, there was a mission called the Grenfell Medical Mission that established itself in the early 20th century. My aunt was trained as part of that tradition. She went on to nurse in Labrador City, which is the mining town, the iron ore mining town, extractive industry town that I grew up in and that she lived in most of her working life as a nurse. So, I guess I would say it sort of emphasizes the point to me that, we are not binary. We have complex relationships in northern and remote communities with these extractive industries because, so frequently they are the basis of the economy. And, my family lived there because of, wanting to have this kind of option to make a living, but it was certainly environmentally not good and not safe for anyone who lived or worked there. So the nature of that community. Another example, and this goes a bit further back. So my aunt Rina graduated from nursing school in 1960. This woman, Millicent Blake Loader, graduated from nursing school in 1940. So there are now many generations of Labrador women of Inuit backgrounds who, in fact, were able to obtain training in nursing and become professionals and working in that region. I think we would certainly have the highest proportion of trained professionals from our own population, from our own community, working in health establishments in our own region. That creates a different kind of dynamic. So what that means is that the people in the establishment are people. There are many people in the establishment working there who are people of the community, who have the values of the community, and I guess I would argue that that can change the nature of practice. That can inherently indigenize the nature of practice. And I'm not, I would be very cautious about overestimating the power of nurses, because I think the role of nurses has been traditionally underestimated and demeaned, within the medical establishment. But nurses are so frequently the very front line. People see nurses before they see doctors. And so they are the very front line. And if that is the face that you meet, how that person interacts with you is really, really fundamentally important. So in Labrador, there is a bit of a history now that is, I guess, that is somewhat somewhat positive in terms of our ability to have inserted ourselves into a medical organization that began with the Grenfell mission that was, an inherently colonialist and racist institution. But, we were able to insert ourselves into that. And I would say, among other things, it allowed women to put themselves in positions of some power and influence and independent incomes, in fact, and that made a contribution to their families and the situation of people in their own communities. How can we change things? How can we improve things? I think fundamentally, people Inuit need to be owners of our own health and healing. And that sense of ownership, which means control, is currently absent or very weak, I would say, in most jurisdictions across Inuit Nunangat. Nurses in practice need to be very aware of ensuring cultural safety. I know this is part of a code of ethics of nurses as professional code of ethics as well, but I think it's something that people kind of need to constantly remind themselves about, that this is a central part of practice. I think everyone, including nursing professionals, have a role to work to improve recruitment and retention of Inuit nurses and identify the impediments. There are many things, obviously, not working very well in terms of recruitment and retention of Inuit nurses, recruitment, retention, education of Inuit nurses. So we need to put our heads together and figure that out, because this situation of, like in Nunavut, seeing only 3% of nurses being Inuit, that has to change. So schools of nursing have a role in that, and other medical faculties like the one that I work in family medicine. We need to examine what barriers exist. I think the current system is a barrier. The current system constitutes a barrier, and we need to look at ways to improve the pathways to nursing. Both the women from Labrador, whose photos I showed you, they were both really recruited from high school. So, we're able to go from high school. Actually, in the case of Millicent Blake Loader, she was recruited before she finished high school. And she was sent away, very far away, to the US from Labrador and finished high school in the US. So it's part of, do we create impediments, or are we facilitating the entry of Inuit and other Indigenous people into the nursing profession? I think I'll probably leave it there. I think I have a huge admiration for nurses. I have the very good fortune of being related to a number of nurses who taught me a lot. So, I think you should give yourselves credit for the kind of influence and power that you can wield, and wield it in a wise and compassionate way. And we need your allyship, and that be used in a wise way. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Nakumik. It's my great pleasure to have been able to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was, again, super empowering for nurses, young nurses, and nurses in general. So for now,
can you go to the last slide, please?
Yeah. Yeah, so now I know it's 8:30. We said it was finished. I don't know if some people have questions. If you do so, you can use the chat function or the raising hand. Um,
1, 2.
Hi. Oops. I don't know, Naomi, if you can check in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I guess in general question that probably a lot of the panelists might be able to answer, but I have a friend of mine who's a nurse, who's also a mutual friend of Naomi's, and he was working at a time in northern Manitoba in some First Nations communities as a nurse, and he's originally from Montreal. And when he started working out there, he was really shocked that there was absolutely no cultural training given to him or any of the other like nurses working with him. And I guess I was wondering if any of you know if there's a similar situation like that here in Quebec. Like, do nurses who work with First Nations people or with Inuit, are they given any type of cultural training to know, like, yeah, how to interact with those people? And if not, is that something you guys think would be an important part of moving forward?
Thank you. That's a great question. I don't know if any of the speakers have an answer or wants to take the lead on that.
Well, I'll say in relation to Inuit and working in Inuit and Nunangat in Inuit communities, it's typically, I think, frequently not part of training. Nunavik Regional Health Board has a training for employees, but I think it is really more who go to Nunavik. But I think it's kind of logistical, it's practical life stuff. It's not really cultural safety. I am working on developing a graduate course on Inuit health that would be offered at McGill in a year or so. But yes, it is necessary, and yes, there is not enough. That's my response.
I can, sorry.
I could
give a response to that because I'm a nurse in Nunavik for 4 years now. So I can tell you just that we have not have any, like Mr. Budgell say, we don't have any course in cultural safety. It's like 2 days of training before to go work in Nunavik. So I can tell you that there's not enough right now that it's being implemented. Yeah.
Yeah, I could chime in about that as well. It's definitely, when I think back to the time that I was in school studying nursing, I learned about Indigenous issues in general in one course at one lecture for about 30 minutes. I do know that that is changing though. There are 2 professors I can recognize among the names here at the Ingram School of Nursing who have taken on the mantle of trying to actually bring this and integrate this into the curriculum. And so shout out to Jody and Françoise for all the work that you do, because I think if it wasn't for the both of you, it would still maybe look like 30 minutes on Indigenous issues. So I think that, you know, it's moving in the right direction, but we definitely need key people, champions within you know, nursing schools and all healthcare professional programs to really keep this moving forward. Yeah.
One thing I was just going to say, if I can just chime in quickly as well, just to add, is you know, we mentioned Joyce's principle, and Joyce's principle, one of the calls essentially is to ensure that cultural safety is implemented. And I guess what's important, and one of my concerns with how cultural safety gets implemented, is that there's a risk of it basically getting depoliticized, which is that, you know, cultural safety, and what people often don't know this, but cultural safety, the concept was essentially developed by a nurse, a Maori nurse from New Zealand in the 1980s, and obviously with others, but, you know, she's the one who's kind of credited with having developed cultural safety. But she developed it because she saw how colonialism and imposed cycles of poverty impacted on the people she was seeing. And so the idea with cultural safety is different than cultural sensitivity training or cultural awareness training, which is that the idea, the core principle of cultural safety is to expose the power dynamic inherent in colonial relationships that manifest in healthcare and try to flip it. And so instead of, you know, kind of trying to quote unquote understand the patient, there's an emphasis put on understanding ourselves and the power that we wield and our history in oppressing, I'm saying our, you know, in terms of as healthcare providers operating within the Western model of healthcare, you know, playing a role in the colonial project. And so that is so central, because I feel like if that reality is centered, then things become a bit easier, actually, right? And in that sense, cultural safety, if it's actually implemented, it'll make better practitioners, better clinicians of all of us for anyone we see, right? Because the mentality is just going to change, because it's actually going to be centered around the person we're seeing, their family, their community, their history. And that recognition is huge compared to the individualistic biomedical model that's kind of shoved down our throats, whether it's in medical school, less so in nursing, but still in nursing as well.
Sorry, I was a bit distracted by the chat. I'm happy to see that people are from across Canada at different nursing schools, so that's really awesome. There's also really nice comments for all the speakers. I don't know if we should go to the last slide because it is 10 minutes over and I just want to respect people's time.
Yeah. So yeah, we want to thank our speakers for sharing your knowledge and your time. We're really grateful for your presence here, and yeah. Also, thank you to everyone that joined the meeting. If you want like future events, or if you want to get in contact with us, you can go follow our page on Facebook. It's McGill Nurses for Planetary Health. Also, as a student, you can join the CANE, and it's free. So just as you know, if you're interested to join. And lastly, we are having a little survey just to have your feedback, because we really want to do others webinars like that. It was our first time, so we know we can improve on many things. So we want your feedback. So I'm gonna put the link. I put it. Oh, perfect! Wow. So yeah. So yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you. It was really an honor to have all of the speakers, and it warms my heart and also inspires me and also snaps me out of my little bubble that I have all at the same time. So thank you so much. I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, we really hope that everyone learned something. I think obviously you have, and that you feel more empowered as nurses or anything you are to act on this battle that we want to win. So yeah. And
in the chat, they share similar thoughts. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for the great initiative that you had, you two. It's just amazing. So bravo to the two of you.
Thank you. Would have been possible without your participation. So.
Yeah. You too, Samir. Thanks for organizing this with us, basically.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's not easy to organize a big event. We didn't know it was going to be so big, but yeah.
You did a great job.
Thanks. Maybe it's not as big as you're used to, but I think it was a good first one. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, you can.
Everyone says really sweet things in the chat.